There's a reason the Chinese ambassador requested a face-to-face meeting with the Philippine president in the middle of this naval exercise. And it's not the reason they're telling you in the press release. I want to walk you through what was actually said in that room. Before I get into it, drop the country you're watching from in the comments, because this is one of those situations where it helps to know who's seeing it from where. I actually read them. So the United States, Japan, and the Philippines just wrapped up 5 days of military exercises in the South China Sea. That part you probably heard. But here's the thing. The exercise ended on July 25th, and the very next day, the Chinese ambassador to the Philippines, a man named Jing Quan, announced he'd just had what he called a positive meeting with President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Now ask yourself, why would he do that? Because if you're a Chinese ambassador in Manila and your country has been watching these naval drills all week, the fighter jets, the surveillance aircraft, the American warships moving through what China claims as its own waters, you don't just schedule a friendly meeting to talk about mutual cooperation. Not unless something else is going on underneath the surface. Let me explain the timeline here, because the timing is everything. These exercises ran from July 21st to the 25th, and they weren't small. We're talking warships from all three nations, Coast Guard vessels, surveillance aircraft that can track movements from 100 miles away, fighter jets. The stated purpose was to improve interoperability between the three allies. That's the official word, interoperability, which is a very polite way of saying we need to get really good at fighting together because we think we might have to. But here's what I found interesting. You see, these drills didn't happen in a vacuum. The day before they started, the Philippine Coast Guard put out a statement. They said Chinese vessels had been seen near 2nd Thomas Shoal. Aggressive maneuvers, blocking routes, the kind of stuff that gets your blood pressure up if you're in Manila. And a few weeks before that, Scarborough Shoal. Same kind of tension. Chinese Coast Guard ships getting closer than they should. Philippine fishermen reporting they were being shadowed. Nothing that made the front page in America, but if you live in the Philippines, you felt it. This is the part that the networks aren't really spending time on. Because when we hear South China Sea drills, most of us in the US just kind of file it under, more stuff happening over there. But this is not a distant conflict. This is the United States putting naval assets right next to Chinese claimed territory. This is Japan, our closest ally in Asia, sailing warships through waters that China has drawn a hard line around. This is the Philippines, a country that spent decades trying to balance between China's economic power and the American security guarantee, having to pick a side. And that decision, that choice, it's already being made. So let's go back to Ambassador Jing Quan, because the language he used is really specific, and the specificity tells you how worried Beijing actually is. He said he had a positive meeting with President Marcos, and that he urged the Philippines to honor its commitments. He also used the phrase, and I want you to hear this exactly, not to tolerate anti-China provocations. Tolerate anti-China provocations. 3 words, 3 really loaded words. Because here's what he's really saying. He's saying, look, we know the Philippines has a treaty with the United States. We know you're required to hold these drills. We're not stupid. But what you can control is what you allow to happen on the ground, what you tolerate, what you let your Coast Guard do when Chinese ships approach, what you say in public. And that's the back channel pressure that nobody's talking about, because China isn't asking the Philippines to break the alliance. That would be too aggressive. They're asking them to tone it down, be a little less cooperative with the Americans, make it harder for the U.S. to use those bases. Slowly, quietly shift the balance. Now, let me tell you why this particular exercise matters more than the last one. Because last year, when the U.S. and the Philippines did drills, Japan wasn't part of them. This year, Japan is. And Japan has its own territorial disputes with China. Japan is also the country that's been saying for years that China is building up military capabilities faster than anyone expected. So when Japanese warships are sailing alongside American ones in the South China Sea, that's a statement. That's Japan saying, we are in this too, and we are not backing down. And China did not like that at all. The Chinese Foreign Ministry put out a statement during the drills. They called them destabilizing. They said they undermine regional peace. That's diplomatic language for you are poking the bear. But the ambassador's meeting with Marcos the very next day, that wasn't diplomatic. That was personal. That was one man sitting across from another and saying, you need to fix this. Now I want to talk about Marcos for a second, because he's in a really complicated position. His family has had a long relationship with the United States, but he also took office promising to engage with China, to keep the trade flowing, to make sure that the Philippines isn't forced into a corner. And that's a difficult needle to thread. Because here's the reality. The Philippines needs China economically. Chinese investment in infrastructure, Chinese tourists, Chinese trade. That's not political talk. That's actual money that keeps the economy moving. But they also need the United States for security, for the treaty, for the warships that show up when Chinese Coast Guard vessels start crowding their islands. So what do you do? How do you balance those two things? And how do you do it without making everyone angry? This is where the tension lives, right in that question. Let me walk you through what actually happened at Second Thomas Shoal. Because this isn't abstract. This isn't diplomats in suits talking about policy. This is a shoal, a piece of rock and water. And Philippine forces have been stationed there for years, literally on an old naval vessel that's been run aground as a sort of makeshift outpost. And China keeps coming closer, sending Coast Guard vessels, blocking supply ships, pressuring the personnel on that grounded ship. And in recent months, the pressure has increased. The Philippine government says Chinese ships have been more aggressive, cutting off lines, doing what they call dangerous maneuvers. The Chinese side says the Philippine vessels are violating their sovereignty. Both of them are convinced they're right. But here's the part I keep thinking about, the part that gives me pause. China has spent years building artificial islands in the South China Sea, military bases with runways, radar installations, the ability to project force across a huge area. And the Philippines, even with U.S. support, doesn't have that capacity, not even close. So when the Chinese ambassador tells the Philippine president not to tolerate anti-China provocations, what he's really saying is, we have the power here, and we expect you to act accordingly. And maybe that's why the U.S. military presence is so important to Manila, because without it, there's nobody to push back. It's just the Philippines, alone, sitting between China and the open Pacific. Now let's talk about the timing of all this, because July 25th, that's the day the exercises ended. And on that same day, the Chinese government published a white paper on maritime cooperation. It's long, it's bureaucratic, but buried in the document is a pretty direct statement about the South China Sea. It says, China will protect its maritime rights and interests and resolutely oppose any infringement. Infringement. That's the word. Meaning they consider these joint exercises an infringement. Meaning they consider the U.S. and Japan and the Philippines acting together as an act of aggression. And they're not going to just sit there and take it. So let me be blunt about what's happening here, because sometimes you have to cut through the diplomatic language and just say it out loud. The United States is trying to contain China. That's the strategy. It's been the strategy for a decade. The pivot to Asia, the alliances, the naval presence, all of it. And China knows that. They're not confused about what's going on. They see the American warships. They see the Japanese destroyers. They see the Philippine Coast Guard suddenly a lot more confident than they used to be. And they're pushing back harder every time. That's the long game. That's what this is really about. Now let me tell you what the public reaction has been in the Philippines, because it's not unified. It's not simple. Some Filipinos are thrilled to see the U.S. back. They remember the old bases. They remember the security guarantee. They've been worried about Chinese encroachment for years, and they see these joint drills as the United States finally showing up. But there's another side, a segment of the population that's wary of the United States, wary of being used as a pawn, wary of a conflict they can't control. And they look at what happened in Ukraine and they wonder, would America really come? Would they put troops on the ground? Would they risk a direct confrontation with China over islands 1,000 miles away? And honestly, it's a fair question, because that's the thing that nobody wants to say out loud. The U.S. has treaty commitments, but the U.S. also has a pattern of getting involved, then pulling back, then leaving allies to deal with the aftermath. And if you're the Philippines, that has to keep you up at night. So when Ambassador Jing Quan sat down with President Marcos and had his positive meeting, what was said in that room? Because the official readout is just happy talk. We discussed ways to move forward. We have a shared future. That kind of language. But the real conversation, the one that matters, was probably something like this. You can keep doing exercises with the Americans. We can't stop you. But if this escalates, if someone gets hurt, if a Chinese ship is damaged, we will not stand by. And you will be the one who has to choose, us or them. That's the real conversation. And Marcos, he has to answer that, not just with the Americans, but with his own people, with the business community that wants Chinese money, with the military that wants American backing, with the population that's watching and waiting. This isn't just about two shoals. This is about what happens when a smaller country gets caught between superpowers. And right now, the Philippines is that country. Now look, I know this can feel abstract. Naval exercises, diplomatic language, strategic rivalries. It's easy to tune out, to just scroll past the headline. But this matters. It matters because what happens in the South China Sea will determine whether we are heading for a major conflict or whether we can somehow manage these tensions for another generation. And I want you to think about something. The Chinese ambassador said he urged the Philippines not to tolerate anti-China provocations. Urged. That's softer than demanded, softer than warned. It's almost friendly. But it also assumes something. It assumes the Philippines can control what other countries do in Philippine waters. It assumes they have the power to stop the US and Japan from conducting these drills, which they don't. So by saying don't tolerate provocations, what Beijing is really saying is stand up to the US. Tell them no. Find a way to get them to stop coming here. That's the expectation. And it's an impossible one. Because the US is not going to ask permission. The US is going to keep sailing through, keep running exercises, keep testing China's claimed boundaries. And China is going to keep sending its own ships, Coast Guard vessels with guns on the deck. And at some point, those two forces are going to come together. Physical, close, real. And then what? That's the question that keeps me up. Not because I think it's going to happen tomorrow, but because every time we do this, every time we send ships and planes and practice interoperability, we raise the stakes. We make the next incident more dangerous. We make it harder to back away. And the thing is, China knows that. They're not blindsided by these exercises. They've been watching for weeks. They've been positioning their own forces. They've been planning their response. So when Ambassador Jing Chuan says, honor your commitments, he's not just talking about the Philippines. He's reminding everyone watching, everyone in Manila, in Washington, in Tokyo. This line you're drawing, we don't accept it, and we will not accept it. Now let me move this to the global level, because the world is watching. Southeast Asia is watching. Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, they all have their own claims in the South China Sea. And they're all watching to see how this plays out. Because if the U.S. backs the Philippines to the hilt and China backs down, those other countries are going to want the same treatment. They're going to want American ships in their waters. They're going to want the alliance to extend to them too. And the U.S. simply doesn't have the fleet to do that everywhere. But if China successfully pressures the Philippines, if they make the U.S. look weak, then everyone else in the region will quietly fall in line. They'll make their own arrangements with Beijing. They'll hedge their bets. And the U.S. alliance structure in Asia, it starts to crumble. So you see, this isn't just a tiny conflict on the other side of the world. This is the whole game, right here, in those waters, on that shoal, in that meeting between an ambassador and a president. And neither side is going to blink. That's the reality. The United States is not going to stop these exercises. It's a point of pride now, a statement of commitment. And China is not going to stop pressuring the Philippines. It's a point of national sovereignty, a test of their resolve. So where does that leave Marcos? He has to manage this every day, every meeting, every conversation. He has to smile with the American general and then go to dinner with the Chinese envoy. He has to say, we value our alliance and we seek peaceful dialogue in the same press conference. He has to walk a line so narrow that one wrong step sends him tumbling. And I got to tell you, I don't envy him. But here's the thing I want you to walk away with. This isn't really about the Philippines. It's not even really about the South China Sea. It's about the United States and China. A confrontation that's been building for years. And what happened last week? Those 5 days of exercises? That's a symptom, a visible symptom of a deeper sickness. Because the U.S. and China have stopped trusting each other completely. Not the way you disagree on trade or climate change or human rights. I mean the kind of distrust where you assume the other side is lying about everything. every word, every proposal, every diplomatic note. You assume they're trying to trap you, to hurt you, to take everything you have. And when you're at that level of distrust, every naval exercise is a threat. Every ambassador's speech is a warning. Every positive meeting is actually a confrontation. You interpret everything in the worst possible light, and you prepare for the worst possible outcome. That's where we are. So let me ask you something, and I want you to really sit with this question. If a U.S. ship and a Chinese ship collide in the South China Sea, what happens next? Not the official response, not the diplomatic statements. What actually happens in the water, in the air, in the decision rooms of Washington and Beijing? Because I don't think there's a plan. I think there's just assumptions. And assumptions are not a plan. That's not how you keep the peace. And yet, here we are, running exercises, sending signals, testing limits, all without a clear understanding of what happens if one of those tests fails. Now, I want to bring it back to what you can actually see in the reporting, because the news coverage of these drills is interesting. Not what they cover, but what they leave out. Most outlets will tell you the US and Japan and the Philippines were improving interoperability. They'll mention the Chinese ambassador urging restraint. They'll say the exercises were routine. But they won't tell you the ambassador's exact words. Not to tolerate anti-China provocations. They won't point out that the meeting happened the day after the exercises, that the timing was absolutely deliberate. And that's why this channel exists. Because the networks, the big ones, the cable ones, the ones with the polished anchors and the fancy graphics, they're not going to tell you what's actually going on. They can't. It's not their job. Their job is to keep you watching ads. My job is to explain what I see, honestly, without the filter. So let me tell you what I think is going to happen next. And this is just my read of the situation, so take it for what it's worth. China is going to keep increasing the pressure on the Philippines. More Coast Guard patrols, more confrontations. Maybe they block supplies to 2nd Thomas Shoal again. Maybe they do something more aggressive. They want to test Marcos. They want to see if he caves, if he orders a de-escalation, if he tells the U.S. to back off. And the United States is going to respond. Maybe not publicly, maybe not dramatically, but they'll send another ship. They'll schedule another exercise. They'll make sure the Philippines feels supported. Because if they don't, if they let China push Manila around, the rest of the region will notice, and they'll draw their own conclusions. So we're in a spiral, and nobody's stopping it. And the scariest part? Neither side wants to be the one who blinks. So they just keep going, escalating, testing, pushing, until something breaks. And when it breaks fast. You don't get a warning. You don't get a diplomatic notice. You just get a collision, or a missile, or a statement that says, "We regret the incident." And that's it. The whole thing changes. I want you to think about that when you hear about the next naval exercise, because there's always going to be a next one. There's always going to be a new ambassador's statement, a new confrontation, a new headline. And it's tempting to tune it out, to say, that doesn't affect me. But it does, because the world we live in, the one our kids are going to inherit, it's being shaped right now in those waters, in those meetings, in the decisions that are being made while we're not paying attention. And the thing is, no single decision is the one that breaks it. It's 1,000 small decisions, 1,000 small pushes, 1,000 small moments where someone could have backed off and didn't. And then one day you wake up and something happened, something bad, and you don't know how we got there. So what do we do? I don't have a neat answer for you. I wish I did. I wish I could say, here's the solution, here's the way out. But I can't. What I can say is, this matters. You watching this video right now, paying attention, that matters. It matters because awareness is the foundation of accountability. And without accountability, people in power just keep doing what they're doing. I'm going to leave you with this. The South China Sea is one of the most heavily militarized regions on Earth. There are more ships, more submarines, more aircraft, more soldiers, more potential for catastrophe than almost anywhere else. And it's not going to get less tense anytime soon. But that doesn't mean we have to accept it. We can pay attention. We can ask questions. We can demand better from our leaders. That's the only thing that ever works. People paying attention. So that's where we are. The drills are over. The meeting happened. The ambassador made his statement. And now we wait. We watch. We see what comes next. But here's the thing about waiting. You can't just wait. You have to be ready. And right now, I'm not sure we are. This isn't over. It's never over. It's just a pause. And we'll be here when the next chapter starts. If you want to stick around for that, you know where to find me.